Welcome to Spirits and Cousins. This is Tish.
I'm Courtney.
And this is the second part, sort of the second part, of Haunted Monterey. The second part is Haunted Cannery Row. So today we're going to talk about Cannery Row. And I know you're thinking, okay, are they going to start off again with what we're drinking? But as Courtney just pointed out to me before we started this, since this is a continuation, we're drinking the same damn thing we were drinking on the first one, which is what? Hillam and...
You have Millam and Green.
Millam and Green.
And I have Mictors.
There you go. So that's what we're drinking. And we're going to hop into Cannery Row. Now, if you remember on the first episode, Courtney talked a lot about Monterey and just the rich history, and not just history, but the rich history of paranormal around it. So there's a ton to do when you come to Monterey. She touched a little bit on Cannery Row, but we wanted to save that for this part two, the second piece of it, that's where I'm going to focus on specifically Cannery Row. So first I'm going to give you a little bit of a brief history and talk a little bit about Cannery Row in general. And then I'm going to talk about some of the characters and some of the pain really around Cannery Row. And then I'm going to talk about the hauntings, because if you come to this part of California, you've got to get to Cannery Row. And it's got a very famous history that you can't talk about Monterey and not talk about Cannery Row.
Truth.
The best part is, from where my house is here in the area, I can walk and be at Cannery Row within 10 minutes. And it's unbelievable to be so close that just to give you all an idea, within, probably a half a mile of my house, I can get to 2 or 3 places where there's paranormal activity. So that's kind of cool.
It's very cool.
So Cannery Row's here in the Monterey area. You might have heard of it because there's been films made about it called Cannery Row. John Steinbeck wrote the book Cannery Row back in 1945. It's famous just for that reason. It was for many years the sardine capital of the world. And when Steinbeck's book appeared in 1945, that's when the sardine operation was at its peak. And that's when Monterey was probably at its prime in terms of popularity. 18 canneries worked day and night, and every cannery had its own bell that when the boat would come in full with fish and sardines, they'd ring that bell, and each cannery had its own sound. And that's when the workers knew to leave home and come back down to the docks and to the canneries to offload and process the sardines. So it was quite a cultural phenomena around here, because it did run 24/7. It was also a mecca for the Chinese that came over. They came in through San Francisco, but they didn't have, not all of them had skills in education, and many of them ended up here during the 30s, 40s, and 50s for the sardine industry. So a lot went on here. Shortly thereafter, probably in the mid-50s or so, the sardine industry and the fishery industry crashed here. And for reasons that even to this day aren't understood, literally the volume of fish that were coming through here dwindled down to less than 10% of what came through, all within about 5 years. Wow. And the sardine factories, canneries virtually disappeared from these waters within 5 years, and all the canneries quickly closed. And a lot of people don't know that. Just think of the pain. And then when I say pain, without getting overly dramatic, pain not just to people that lost everything they had, families that ran out of money and were homeless, and businesses, obviously, that closed down. But you had people that did drastic things to survive, and many people, did things that were illegal. They had record high suicides in this area. They had more suicides in those 5 years than they had in the last 100 years because of everything going out of business. Perhaps the decline was due to overfishing, changes in the ocean current, or environmental factors. No one will ever know. They've never been able to prove why. But you went from an area that was just like you see in the movies, this huge kind of economy going on, and all these people coming through from other countries that were coming here to work, and it was gone in the blink of an eye. But this place existed long before Cannery Row, and Courtney talked a lot about that when she was talking about Monterey, going back to the 1600s, when the Spanish were really running the whole area and running the state of California. It's likely, even prior to that, it's likely the spot where the Indians witnessed the Portuguese trying to get here in 1542, but they were unable to anchor due to severe storm. The next time the Portuguese tried coming back here was 60 years later. And then the Indians witnessed the Spaniards anchor and try to claim the land for themselves. So everyone saw this part of the country here as beautiful, and they all wanted to claim it. And we have these coastlines that are pretty hard to anchor in, and we had Indians that were here first, watching people trying to get onto their land to steal it from them. That stirred up a lot of negative and hostile energy when these people started to die, especially the Indians, and they were here long before Cannery Row. I would say that that's when the Spaniards anchored, they were here for good, and this time they stayed and claimed it for themselves. So when you walk along Cannery Row today, there's still a few recognizable buildings that were here even before it was Cannery Row, and many of them date back to when the Spaniards were still here back in the 1800s.
Yeah.
The other thing about Cannery Row is, many of the cannery buildings and pieces of them are still here, and they've built buildings around them, and it's one of the biggest tourist draws along California's central coast, which is everything kind of south of San Francisco. And it does include areas such as Monterey, Carmel, Big Sur, and all the way down to like Hearst Castle and Pebble Beach. It's also home to some of the most haunted locations, as we've been talking about. And Cannery Row has its own haunts. And that's what we're going to talk about today. So this episode, we're going to cover a famous area just in and of itself of Cannery Row. And we talk about Monterey a lot, but Cannery Row's got a pretty interesting history as well, and a lot of people that came out of here. There's a lot of people and a lot of pain, and when you have those two things together, you usually have some paranormal, some activity, some residual stuff going on, and you usually have some hauntings happening too. So Cannery Row really was filled with pain and poverty, along with all the richness that was going on during the 40s and 50s. And you had characters like Steinbeck writing in his book, Cannery Row. By the way, if you get a chance and you want to know more about the Central Coast and what it was like back in the days, read Cannery Row. It's not a long book. It's probably a 2-hour read, 3 hours tops. And most of those characters in there, although the names have been changed, were real people that lived here. From Doc Rickett to the dude that owns the grocery store, those people really existed. Many of those people were instrumental in the economy here and are really the canvas and the characters that are such a huge part of the tourist draw today. The Chinese that were such a fixture here in the early 1900s were basically the ones that drove a lot of the growth during the 30s all the way through the 50s with the canneries. They built and did a lot of the construction in the area. They were forced to rebuild several times because as some of the other folks moved in, the Asians, the Chinese, were considered lower class. They didn't want them too near the town. And they kept pushing them further and further down the coastline, and they had to rebuild their homes several times because they kept getting pushed out of where they were. One of the big things the Chinese brought to Cannery Row when we talk about, all the fisheries and the canneries was the technique of preserving the fish and drying it for shipment. So when the other non-Asians started seeing what the Chinese were capable of and what they were doing, both the Chinese and even some of the other immigrants became targets because they knew more than the people that were here. That created, believe it or not, a lot of skirmishes and a lot of fighting and a lot of what we would call today racism. There was a lot of pain associated with that. There was a lot of violence. There were a lot of murders. There were a lot of people that went missing. That was a lot of what Cannery Row could be, so it wasn't all just the good stuff. 2 World Wars, Prohibition, the Great Depression really imprinted their marks on Cannery Row and all of its alumni and the people that were there. And I think that the disappearance of the sardines in the 40s really just imprinted more pain in the area. So it's an area with a lot of pain, a lot of energy, and a lot of activity. Courtney talked about something earlier, the Monterey Bay Aquarium. There are parts of that aquarium that are haunted. There are parts of that aquarium that have energy and spirits. And as we go along Cannery Row, I'm going to cover some of, the different areas that are haunted. The fishermen in Cannery Row exist all along there, their energy, their spirits. With more than 16 canneries, the workers and the immigrants worked very long hours. Each cannery, had dozens and dozens of people working for them. And, many of the guests staying in the hotels and going to the aquarium have reported, a lot of these happenings over the years, not just seeing ghosts along the street or shadows, but even the workers at the aquarium have reported seeing apparitions and even things that look like white smoke. And a lot of the stuff have already been documented. Mysterious sounds, opening doors in the aquarium as an example, ghosts that are napping. A few of the anomalies seen along the streets include ghosts napping on the streets, like in corners, and people walk up and all of a sudden there's nothing there. So it's a pretty common story of people walking along Cannery Row late at night and hearing boat whistles. And there's no boat, all the boats are in, and the boats that are there now are mostly for the tourist trade. But hearing boat whistles in a distance or trains coming down the tracks. So there used to be a train that ran parallel along Cannery Row. It's no longer there. That's a very common occurrence, is for people to hear trains coming down the tracks, but there's no trains. So there's a lot of this energy around here. I can tell kind of as a longtime resident that if you walk along Cannery Row at night or along the path where the train used to be, there is an eerie quietness around 10 p.m. in the evening when you just feel all this energy. You can feel it. You can feel it in the air. And it used to, that used to be the time that if I had to go out, I didn't really want to walk. Now I want to go out. I want to feel that. And I want to feel what was here. And sometimes you can hear voices in a distance. Sometimes you can hear what sounds like whistles, like boat whistles. And the tourists have all gone. This place, the streets roll up around 8:00. There's been many times when I've heard the train on the train tracks. There's been times when I've heard those boat whistles. So walking around Cannery Row at night is a real experience, and I suggest that any of you coming to this part of the world do that. There was a few times where it wasn't. It was a pretty common thing. I'd be out walking my dog along the path, and I could hear, like, you could faintly hear kind of like a train coming. The other thing is it was only a few blocks from that Ed Ricketts Memorial. We're going to talk a little bit about Ed Ricketts next, but I know something was there because my dog stopped and stuck his nose up in the air, like there was something to smell, but he couldn't see it. Now, what would cause that? The dog's all walking around, and all of a sudden, at the same time I hear something, the dog stops and sticks his nose up in the air.
Well, animals are sensitive.
Yeah. No, you're right. So that's the kind of stuff that happens around Cannery Row. So I talked, that was like the fishermen and the people that lived here. They led very hard lives. A lot of them died here. They didn't have proper medical care. They lived and worked very hard, and a lot of them died in harsh ways because they couldn't get medical care, and many of them died because they were Asian, or they were Chinese, or they weren't like everyone else, or they were taking jobs away from people in San Francisco. But it was a hard life. So there was another person that lived along Cannery Row, not necessarily originally, but he was a fixture, and his name was Ed Doc Ricketts. So Ed Ricketts, but they called him Doc Ricketts. He wasn't really a doctor, and he had a lab called the Pacific Laboratories. I think it was Pacific Laboratories. Yeah. It was kind of like right next to the aquarium. As I mentioned earlier, Ed Ricketts, as he was called, was kind of a fixture. They have a memorial because he had actually gotten hit by a train. But he was a marine biologist and a good friend, and to the local author John Steinbeck, which everyone knew because he won a bunch of he won the Pulitzer and won a bunch of awards and wrote all these great books, and he wrote Cannery Row. He is the main character in Cannery Row. He was in several of Steinbeck's books. Everyone called him Doc. He made his home on Cannery Row. His original lab was actually in Pacific Grove, was in a building a ways away, but the majority of his time here in this area was down on Cannery Row. A couple of things that you should know is that his lab had originally burnt down. It was a stucco structure. It had originally burnt down, and insurance wouldn't give him enough money to build it the way it was, so he had to rebuild it kind of on a dime. Steinbeck helped him with that and gave him money to do that, along with the money he got from insurance, and it got rebuilt. It was a meeting place for himself, Steinbeck, and a group of other guys in the area, and they met there almost daily for drinks. And you all will find this very interesting, but they were into mysticism. And correct me if I'm wrong, I think that Courtney has a little bit of information on this, but they did seances over there?
The little bit I've been able to find, it sounds like they were very curious about mysticism, and it is quite possible that they also held seances. I have yet to find actual proof of that, but That's what I've been finding.
So right along Cannery Row, if you're a tourist and you're walking along there, that lab still exists. It sticks out because it looks like the oldest building on the whole street. And you can actually tour the lab as part of a once a month tour done by the city of Monterey. But you have to be pretty diligent and plan that out in advance. And there's only one Saturday a month they do it. But, you get to see what happened, what it's like inside. They've got kind of like some notebooks and tools and specimen tanks that are on display there. You can see there. Also, the Monterey Bay Aquarium took out of the lab almost everything he had in his office, and they have a whole section of Monterey Bay Aquarium that's Ed Ricketts' office. It's really cool. So Ed worked and lived there from around 1928 to 1948. That's when he was killed and on the train tracks that I was talking about earlier. He was going to grab some food to make dinner for some friends that were coming over, and his car stalled on the tracks, and he kept trying to get the car started. I don't know why he didn't jump out, but he stayed in the car, kept trying to move it, get it over the tracks. He didn't do it in time. He got hit less than 6 blocks from the lab, and he lived for a few days, but then he didn't make it. So there is there's a lot of evidence that he's still around here. And he loved Cannery Row. He had a group of friends, and it's believed that he continues to come around. I think that that's definitely something you got to do if you come to Monterey. You got to walk along there. You got to go to his memorial, but you got to do it late at night. And you got to sit and listen. Put your cell phone away. Make sure you don't have earpods in your ears, and you got to sit and listen. There's also people have heard a female's voice sobbing right at that same place, sobbing at the scene of the crash. And like I said, the great thing is you can actually go there and listen for yourself. Okay? So let's get back to the laboratory. There's been several eyewitness accounts of seeing strange moving lights over the rickety front stairs of the building, leading to the building, as well as a shadow figure emerging from the lab building late at night. And that's been captured many times by people and reported. So shadow figure emerging from the lab, late in the evening, a dark shape with no kind of like real discernible features, strolls down the stairs of the building before vanishing down the street. That is the most common. It's been reported many, many, many times. Okay. So that's Doc Ricketts, Pacific Labs. Check it out. Almost across the street is Wing Chun Market. It still exists today. It's the guy that owns it. His name is Yak Yi. Why is Yak Yi important? Yak Yi, when the sardine business went down, he went and bought up almost a substantial amount of real estate along Cannery Row. So he's known for that. But first he's known for Yak Yi's Wing Chun Market during the heyday. So from the 20s through the 40s, that was the market. He had everything. Everyone went in there. They got everything there, from supplies for their boats to the food that they ate, to the beer they drank, to the cigarettes they smoked. Anything they needed, they went there, and he had everything in there. So on a daily basis, Steinbeck, Ricketts, Ed Ricketts, Doc Ricketts, they all went there, and it was right across from his lab. So it was the kind of thing where they would walk across and get a bottle of beer and come back, or they'd walk across and get something to eat and come back, or they needed a rope for their boat, they'd walk across and get it and come back. It was a general store with everything. And he ended up owning probably about a third of Cannery Row real estate-wise. He is in Steinbeck's novel too, Cannery Row. in there, it's called the Lee Chung Grocery Store. But in real life, it was called Wing Chung Market. And if you see it today, on the side of the building, you can still see faintly the Wing Chung Market. So Yak Yi is Lee Chung in Cannery Row. And Yak Yi came from China in 1913, and he was very pivotal in developing the process to dry squid to export to China. He made a lot of money that way, but he also made a lot of money selling people things at pretty high prices and buying a bunch of real estate in the Monterey area, particularly along Cannery Row. There have been many, many sightings of dark figures coming in and out of that market and that building. And it's been known, if you go into that market late at night, that after it gets dark outside, when you're in the market walking around, they say that you can still hear him tapping his ring on the countertop. You hear that? That's my knuckle top hitting the table. He used to sit in the back of the store and tap his ring on the countertop. So these are all very famous places you got to visit. And one last thing, when Ed Ricketts was killed in that train collision with his car, it was Yak Yi that purchased his lab after he died. So that's pretty interesting. So a lot of stuff going on there. There's a lot of activity going on there. People have been known to park across the street and just watch the window, see what's happening there. As you walk along Cannery Row, especially at night, the sounds you hear, the boat whistles, the trains, you can feel the energy. A lot of those canneries, they've built hotels and things like that in. So you get this feeling of history, and you also get this feeling of, well, you're in a tourist spot, but you can feel the history, no doubt. You can, during the day, you can walk to some of the places where the canneries were, and you can still see the cement foundations, and what do you call those things, Courtney? Like those big cement things where they would throw the fish in from the boats and stuff like that.
I have no idea.
So Cannery Row, rich, it's haunted in a much different way from Monterey.
Yes.
I would tell you that racism was alive and well along Cannery Row. I was going to ask you, maybe you know this, but we don't really talk a lot about the Indians that were here before all of this. Mm-hmm. I wonder what happened to them, but there's probably a lot of pain associated with that.
I have no doubt that there's huge amounts of pain associated with that, because they were here for
That's right.
over 2,000 years ago. I mean, they've been here for such a long time.
Yeah.
And then to have all these other people from different countries come in and overtake them to take the land. Right. It's heartbreaking, I'm sure. And there's so much anger often in that.
Yeah. So that's Cannery Row. It's quite a place to see. I encourage you to visit it. We are trying to get in to do an investigation at Doc Ricketts' lab. What makes this area amazing is you have this book that is probably one of the most famous books ever written. And a lot of these places still exist, and you can walk down there and see what's in this book. That's, to me, is surreal. You read this book and the main character works in a lab, and that lab we just went to last month.
We did. It was so neat.
Yes.
And the interesting thing to me, too, is John Steinbeck was very polarizing. The locals of Monterey who weren't friends with him did not like that he wrote about Monterey and the people of Monterey at all.
Yeah.
And so he was not well beloved around here. I believe he is now.
Yeah,
but
after
at that
he
time,
died.
he was not.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah. So that's Cannery Row. And it is it's this whole area. It's just, you can't go but 4 or 5 blocks and run into something haunted.
Yep, you can't.
So that's Cannery Row. We are trying to get in to investigate Doc Ricketts' lab.
Mm-hmm.
We've got some other investigations coming up, but we are going to talk about what we did last night.
Yes, that'll be a good one.
So maybe that'll be next. Las
Coaches.
Adobe. So we thank you for listening to Spirits and Cousins. I'm Tish.
I'm Courtney.
And Courtney, where can people find us?
You guys can find us spiritsandcousins@gmail.com. We are at Spirits and Cousins on Instagram and TikTok. We're going to start putting up some videos more often. That's some good stuff. There's some really fun stuff coming up.
And you know what? We were just talking about this. We want to hear your story. So if you have a story, write us at spiritsandcousins@gmail.com. You probably noticed we've had a few folks on here already telling their stories and their experiences with spirits and paranormal. We want to hear from you. We want to hear your stories. We'll put you on. If you don't want to be on, we'll tell your story for you.
Exactly.
So thank you, and until next time, have a good one, and thanks for listening.